Next that we're going to discuss now is the step 1.4 no, to determine the attribute domains. No, wait lang ha. Ayaw magpakita. Hello. Dali lang po. Ayun, okay na. So, the objective of this step is to determine domains for all attributes in the model. A domain is a pool of values for which one or more attributes draw their values. So, yeah, this is just a recap kung ano ibig sabihin ng domain, no? So, anyway, we have an example naman. So, the attribute domain of valid staff numbers as being a 5-character variable length, the first two characters as the letters, and the next one to 3 characters as digits in the range of 1 to 99. Yeah. And the possible values for the sex attribute of the staff as being either M or F. No? So therefore, the domain of this attribute is a single character, M or F. Okay. And a fully developed data model specifies the domains for each attribute and includes the allowable set of values for the attribute. No? So ano lang yung pwedeng value na pwede sa attribute na yun. For example, yung uh, since na-specify na dito na ito yung domain ng attribute domain ng sex attribute, MF, so hindi pwedeng hanggang doon lang talaga, MF lang talaga yung value niya, hindi pwedeng C or A. So yan. So yun nga, ito yung ibig sabihin ng ito, no? So in the fully developed data model that specifies the domain. So in your domain, you also need to include ano lang yung allowable set of values for the domain, the size and format of the attribute. So for example, yung kanina na describe kanina, no? It's a staff number. Yung size niya is 5, 'di ba? Yung size niya is 5. Tapos na-specify dito ano yung format niya. So yung format na niya is yung first two characters are letter, and then yung remaining are digits. So yan. This first one is the good example, no? Na-specify na yung bale in specifying the domain for the attribute, kailangan mo ring i-specify kung ano yung size at format ng attribute na yan. If applicable, no? If applicable. Okay, so document the attributes as attribute domains are identified, record their names and characteristics in the data dictionary, update the data dictionary entries for attributes to record their domain in place of the data type and length information. Okay. Okay, so next we have here is the determine the candidate primary and alternate key attributes. So this step is concerned with identifying the candidate keys for an entity and then selecting one to be the primary key. So ganun lang. People's names generally do not make good candidate keys. Kasi for example, we may think that a suitable candidate key for the staff entity, for example, yung mag-assign ka ng candidate primary key for the staff entity. You think na yung name can be suitable candidate key, no? But it is possible for two people na magkaroon ng parehong pangalan. So that's why hindi pwede. Yan. So in such cases, rather than coming up with the combination of attributes that may provide uniqueness, it may be better to use an existing attribute that would always ensure uniqueness. So, yun nga, rather than combining two attributes para magkaroon ka ng tinatawag na composite key, no? Meron ka it's better na mag-ano ka na lang. Pumili ka na lang ng kung ano yung kung anong meron na attribute, no? And that attribute also ensures uniqueness. 'Di ba? For example, yung staff number, attribute sa staff entity. Always man na yung staff number is always unique. 'Di ba? Ganun lang, no? In yung gagawin mo in finding the primary key or candidate keys, no? You just check lang kung whether that attribute always has a uh, unique value for each entity occurrences sa staff. For example, sa student, di ba? Student na entity, always man na yung student ID number is unique across all students. Yan. So, another example, owner number sa private owner. Usually, mga ano talaga, mga attributes that have number, no? Staff number, owner number, they are the usual candidates for a primary key, no? Na kung walang existing attribute, no? Walang existing attribute, you can define na lang a new attribute that would provide uniqueness. Pwede ka mag-generate na lang ng panibagong attribute. Let's say ID, no? You could name that as an ID, yung pangalan ng attribute na yun, ID. Isali mo na to, yung ID sa attributes ng entity na yun. Okay, so when choosing a primary key for among the candidate keys, so let's say for example we have more than one primary key na na-identify, no, as candidate keys. Use the following guidelines. So the candidate key with the minimal set of attributes na candidate key that is least likely to have its value change. So importante, no, na yung value, for example, staff number. Staff number is a primary key talaga kasi it's very unlikely na yung staff number mo is magbabago. 'Di ba? Even for example, kahit nga yung license number natin or yung student number natin, no, it doesn't change. So yeah, that's also you need to consider, no, guidelines, no, in to help you selecting your primary key. Those attributes na less likely na magbabago yung values niya. And minimal set of attributes as much as possible. If you could introduce a attribute nga, simple lang siya, hindi siya composite. So pwede. Ano? And the candidate key with also fewest characters for those with textual attributes. So not all the time na yung primary key is integer. Sometimes yung staff number is hindi siya integer but it's a combination of characters and numbers. So kung 5 characters lang siya, no, pwede na yun. You can consider it as a candidate key. Candidate key with the smallest maximum value for those with the numerical attributes. And then the candidate key that is easiest to use from the user's point of view. Okay, so after that, no, after you have identified your primary and alternate keys, you record these in the data dictionary. So, wala akong example for that, but you can just create on your own. Paano yung diskarte mo. Or perhaps you could go back to your data dictionary. Ito kasing data dictionary to, this is, you can introduce, as you notice, itong may mga dash. So, you can actually introduce more columns. Let's say for example, ito kung primary key ba to, So, pag sinabi mong yes, ibig sabihin, that is your primary key. If no, hindi siya primary key. So, yeah, you can introduce another column na naman para sa Basta, you make sure you include that sa data dictionary mo. Itong whether a certain attribute is primary key or not. Yan. And alternate keys as well as yung yung domain. No, dapat nga kasali na pala dito. Ito na pala. Data types. Hindi pala lang pala to. Data type and length lang pala to. You also need to include din para the domain. So, when we say domain, ano lang yung allowed values, tsaka ano yung length ng character, and as well as yung format, no? Kung may attributes that follows a certain format, you also need to put that here. So, yeah. Asa na tayo? Okay, so next we have is the considering the use of enhanced modeling concepts. So in this step, we have the option to continue the development of the ER model using the enhanced modeling concepts, namely specialization, generalization, aggregation, and composition. Itong aggregation at saka composition, di ko na ito in-introduce sa lesson since you may not, optional lang siya. But ito, this is necessary if may ma-identified ka na entities that share common attributes. So, yeah. So, if we select the specialization approach, we attempt to highlight the differences between entities by defining one or more subclasses of a superclass entity. Basically, yun nga, sa going back to the step sa ito na lang, balik tayo dito para magets nyo. Going back dito, no? And ito, this one. So, sa potential problems. Diba, as I mentioned a while, that you could encounter potential problems as you assign attributes to entities. Ma-discover mo nga merong mga entities that share similar attributes. So, if you're going to, for example, itong assistant and supervisor, they both share the attribute staff number, name, sex, and date of birth. So, that's the time na, yun nga, you could either use sandali lang specialization, no, na approach, no. Kung specialization na approach, we attempt to highlight the differences between the entities by defining one or more subclasses. This has already been itong specialization approach, I have already discussed this in the lesson 2. So yeah, if you want to understand this more deeper, just go back to the lesson 2 about enhanced modeling concepts, no? So also, if you want to introduce the generalization approach, so we attempt to identify the common features between entities to identify a generalizing superclass entity. So anyway, these two approaches have been discussed na in the lesson 2. So, kindly rewind na lang. You could either choose one of these. Pili ka lang. Ano ka ba? Generalization ba yung approach mo nag-execute? Or specialization approach ba yung gagawin mo? Okay. So there are no strict guidelines on when to develop the ER model using enhanced modeling concepts, as the choice is often subjective and dependent on the particular characteristics of the situation that is being modeled. So as a useful rule of thumb, when considering the use of these concepts, always attempt to represent the important entities and their relationships as clearly as possible in the ER diagram. Yeah. Next, we proceed now with the next step is to check the model for redundancy. No? In this step, we examine the conceptual data model with a specific objective of identifying whether there are any redundancies present, no? And removing any that does exist. So the three activities in this step are we examine the one-to-one relationships sa mga entities, no? Yung mga basically yung mga relationships na may one-to-one, yung relationship type nila, and you remove the redundant relationships, and then last, consider time dimension. So first, we examine the one-to-one relationships. So in the identification of entities, we may have identified two entities that represent the same object in the enterprise. So for example, we may have identified the two entities, client, no, ito lang, and renter, that are actually the same. So in other words, client is a synonym for renter. So in this case, the two entities should be merged together. Okay. If the primary keys are different, choose one of them to be the primary key and leave the other as alternate key. Yeah. So yun nga, basically what happens is, let's say sa pag-decide mo ng ER model mo, you have failed to na-realize mo lang pala after checking the model for redundancy na meron pa palang there are entities pala na parehas lang pala sila ng concept. So yun yun nga, you merge them together and then pili ka lang kung ano yung primary key. For example, ito this one has its own primary key. This one has its own primary key. Pili ka lang kung alin sa primary key nila yung pipiliin mo and leave the other as alternate key. Yeah, ganun lang. And as for the removing redundant relationships, a relationship is redundant if the same information can be obtained via the other relationships. We are trying to develop a minimal data model, and as redundant relationships are unnecessary, they should be removed. Yeah. So it is relatively easy to identify whether there are more than one path between two entities. However, this does not necessarily imply that one of the relationship is redundant, as they may represent different association between entities. Anyway, we have an example para magets nyo. For example, itong rents na relationship. We're going to remove this relationship na to kasi redundant na kasi siya. No? Ito kasi, this is a direct relationship between client and property for rent. Pero, meron din naman tayong indirect relationship between property for rent and client via the lease. For example, ito, kung iti-trace natin, ba? Since there is an indirect relationship between the property for rent and client, no, through the lease na attribute. And I think mas accurate instead having a direct relationship between the client and property for rent, mas accurate pa to na mas sa eksakto or akma to na representation of the relationship indirect, no? So that's why we remove this rents relationship. Yeah. Okay. So we now have dahil lang. I think I just have to cut this into a different video kasi pang mahaba na yung no.